So what they were looking at was how to get criminality and feeble-mindedness first and foremost out. So people that would have Down syndrome or cleft palate. It used to be if you were born with a cleft palate that they said that you were kissed by the devil. And that was the reason why your face was marred like that. Let's see. People with low IQ. Hypersexuality, which I find very interesting. So one of the things that they used to do was if it was perceived that a guy was a chronic masturbator, or if a man accused his wife of having too high of a sex drive, they called it, on the other side of it was passionlessness, and then the other side of it was hyper-passion sensitivity. So they put people in mental institutions for guys who jerk off too much. I mean, can you think about it? It's like, think about how many people would be in mental institutions today if we were still running against some of those criteria, right? So it could be a broad range of anything. People with schizophrenia, even though you got to keep in mind there was no schizophrenia. The term didn't exist. None of the mental health stuff existed. It was you either were normal, whatever normal was, or you weren't. It was very subjective. So then people could have their family members institutionalized. And it's interesting because some of the rationale that people came up with, you could pretty much get just about anybody committed, depending upon, one, how much money you had, and two, who you knew. So people that had, black sheep of the family, if they were rich enough, they would be put into what we would consider upper class mental institutions now. And this happened all into the 1970s. So we think that it's, one, most of us don't even know about it, but those of us who do know about it think that it happened, way back when. But it was actually common still into the 50s and 60s. And then there were still instances of sterilization up into the 1970s. So there were thousands of people that ended up being sterilized, but they attempted to get it through Congress first several times. It didn't work. I wrote a research paper. If you get into the New York Times archives, from 1911 to 1913, which you got to remember is the amp up to World War I, you got all this stuff happening all at once. And Francis Galton was arguing that the Eugenic Record Office should be the sole authority on marriage and no longer the church and no longer laymen. So it should not be the state. It should not be the church. It should be the Eugenic Record Office that would be accountable for saying who was fit to marry. So if your parents, you may not even know this, but your parents, definitely my parents, maybe your parents, definitely my parents, definitely my grandparents and your grandparents had to be seen by a doctor before they could get a marriage license.
They were fit to breed, essentially.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So after World War II, they had to change the language of it because, speaking of conspiracy theories, so Adolf Hitler was actually reading pamphlets from Cold Spring Harbor in prison when he wrote Mein Kampf. We gave him the idea, which is one of the reasons why we were slow to get into World War II, because we were already doing it and had already been doing it, not in concentration camps per se, but we had already been finding ways to experiment on people medically and to sterilize them for 40-ish years before Hitler came up with it.
So he was in prison and he read an American book on eugenics and he thought, I'll make the German the pure race type of thing.
Yeah, so Cold Spring Harbor is still one of the leading genetics research labs in the world, and it's in New York. And the Rockefeller Foundation actually was backing the eugenics movement heavily. So the Rockefeller Foundation funded World War II on both sides.
Wow. Wait, they funded both. They funded the enemies on both sides, or however many sides there were.
Yeah, they wanted the research. Now, lots of people are going to have whatever opinion that they have about that, but it's there. In fact, the Rockefeller Foundation is still, if you go to the eugenics archives, there's an online museum for it now, basically, and it still has the Rockefeller Archives, Rockefeller Foundation in the byline for contributing material. They own the rights to most of it still.
Wow. So this isn't common knowledge to people. Was it hidden up in some way, like from the
It's just
70s
it's
on?
not
Or
talked about. This is not talked about. See, the term eugenics morphed into for the greater good, which got morphed into common sense and social awareness. And now I think some of it would be called emotional intelligence, which is not accurate, but in terms of the baseline concept of measuring people, think about it. How many Facebook quizzes do we do, and different things that are scientifically proven to measure your IQ or to measure your personality type, or it's like, what kind of villain would you be? All that comes from studying thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of people over the last 130 years. So it became a national craze. They used to call it the Better Babies competitions, because the issue was that they could get people on the coast. It was fascinating. It became an American pastime in the 20s that you would basically paper yourself like a dog. So people researched, those websites that are like Find Your Ancestor. A lot of that came from the original research that was foundationally laid during this time period, because people were researching their heredity so that they could track their family tree, and then they would send that information into the eugenic record office, and it became a widespread thing. They used to give prizes for the most eugenically sound sermon as a competition.
I have a quick question. So like all these
Yeah.
Facebook quizzes and getting our heredity, these information, are we kind of pre-selecting ourselves or giving them the information to see if we're worthy of
Well, and I don't know.
procreating?
I mean, I don't know if any of that is really dubious now, but that kind of thinking came from, they call it the quest for the perfect baby. And the Better Baby contests were from 1908 to 1916, and they were held in state fairs. So like in 4-H competitions, when you'd bring a calf and then they would give it a blue ribbon, they were doing that with kids. So it was typically 6 months to 2 years. They had some that were older, but from 1908 to 1916, it started in the Louisiana Fair in Shreveport, Louisiana, and it mirrored the theories that the eugenics movement came up with around judging health. And in 1913, it was in the Woman's Home Companion magazine, which co-sponsored. And during the late 19th century, people started actively promoting the idea of finding proper health or better health or the quest for the perfect kid. So they used to put it under the idea of improving child welfare and like mother health. And so parent-teacher conferences started getting involved. You had what we would call the auxiliary clubs. The auxiliary clubs were big in on it, and they were judged on a scale of up to 1,000 points. And they would look at their physical, their background as far as their heredity, their physical appearance, what could be perceived as IQ. I don't know really how you measure IQ to a 6-month-old, but they thought they could. And they would promote it as health, having proper health. So one of the major issues that they were running into, especially in the early 1900s, was there weren't doctors everywhere. You couldn't just go make an appointment with a doctor depending upon where you were. Sometimes you'd have to walk a day or whatever to actually find somebody who could look at you. So they put together during these 4-H competitions, so to speak. As I said, it's an overgeneralization, so people are going to be like, that's not really true. That's true. I'm overgeneralizing. But the 4-H competitions that they would bring their kids to, there would be people there that could check them for health. So then they got buy-in from the local, state and local governments, so it was promoting the overall health and welfare of their cities. So people would send in their information, and then it got stored in the eugenics record office. It went to Congress, actually, a couple of different times, one of which was during 1911 and 1913. They were actively arguing that the church should no longer be allowed to say who was fit to marry and not. One of my favorite quotes is, "Some people born burden the rest." And another picture that I'll show you is from the winning family of the Fritter family contest in Topeka, Kansas, where I'm from. So it was the Kansas Free Fair. There was several, it kind of off-spread. So, but the Fritter family contests were also where the pastors would write sermons and send them in, and they would get a financial prize for having the most eugenically sound sermon. So a lot of the research on eugenics has been done from a science viewpoint, but very little has been done from a religious viewpoint, which is where I went after it. Where did the church stand in all of it? How does that look? And interestingly, the Catholics and the Jews were originally all about, because they didn't want Catholics marrying non-Catholics, and they didn't want Jews marrying non-Jews. So just that right there lined up. Then there was everything else. So the fallout of what that would look like, what they didn't confront, was what it would take to have it happen. So given the economic downfalls of Europe and the United States in the late 1800s, early 1900s, then into World War I, then into the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl era, you had pretty much every catastrophic event that could happen happening all at once, similar to now. We're in the middle of a pandemic. People are laid off. We've got racial tensions. I mean, the mirror of 1911, 1928, 1932, and 1936 all together is what we're living right now in a very different sort of way.